All right. So we'll come back to Chris's uh, really sort of contextualizing from a sociolinguist perspective. But if I can really now begin in terms of like from Cockney culture's viewpoint about our experience and really our message, we need to talk about Cockney. And why do we do that? Some context. So our key issue is that working class cultures don't have cultural institutions to defend or advance their interests. As a result, their story is defined and told by others. And we've come across tacit evidence that the 660-year-old Cockney identity is perceived by many as a white, exclusively white working class, and by some a racist identity. And we're witnessing institutional discrimination, where we've carried out a new study examining the Mayor of London's office, revealing a denial even of the existence of Cockney and Cockneys, which leads to discrimination and injustice, bad policy, and we believe something worse. And feeding upon this tacit emergence of Cockney, sociologists, we would suggest, are compounding this, and I use this stark word of liquidation of Cockney culture with the concept of multicultural London English. And if I can elaborate a bit more about where we're coming from on this. So Cockney, what does it exist? Is it a postcode, a vernacular, an identity, or an attitude? Say first recorded use back in 1362. The foundation myth of the sound of Bow Bells 250 years later emerged in 1617. And we witnessed a 20th century diaspora where the Cockney community spread out from its traditional heartlands of inner London to much further afield. And yeah, we've got context here that using Google Ngram in usage of the word Cockney in printed text, there's been a sort of rude, robust health of Cockney. You can see the rise over the last 40 years, recording a 24% plus growth, a slight dip in recent years, but nonetheless a fundamental contradiction to the idea that Cockney is dying. And a bit of evidence there from another Google Ngram, pie and mash are seen as a staple ingredient and certainly food of Cockney. Massive rocket in increase online. So maybe this issue about is Cockney dying or its culture dying, there's some question marks I would suggest is in data too. And it's surviving despite the efforts of some. And as I say, so, you know, we've got a story here of a culture that is, by certain accounts, alive and well. But I say we've come across anecdotal evidence of a Cockney race identity. This is a script, and we've been making copy of the presentation available for people afterwards. But you know, we approached last year someone to speak at one of our events, and we thought, you know, be a natural fit. And there's a quote: "I don't identify as a Cockney. I've never used the term to describe myself. I do know it's still recognised as a contemporary subculture. I've always found it quite a reductive term associated with a narrow stereotype which doesn't reflect my experience. I see myself more as a post-war working class, multicultural, educated Newham. I've never been hot picking, don't like Chaz and Dave, sound my H's, don't care how West Ham do on a Saturday, and I really hate the Okie Kokie. The only people I know refer to themselves as Cockney, live in Essex, as escapees from the multicultural East London I embrace, where they can enjoy the lifestyle of a romanticised Eastern past by visiting the Cockney theme park that is Leigh-on-Sea. And by the way, I'm not a fan of Only Fools and Horses, which I think negatively stereotypes Cockneys. Johnny Spate, however, got it right. So, as I say, a response that surprised us, but some profound insight that really got us down this path of maybe like there is this evidence of this tacit recognition. It goes beyond that. So we've done a study of the Mayor of London's website. It's an issue promptly because we studied the Mayor of London's cultural strategy, because when we started our work last year, we looked at the cultural strategy, the Mayor of London's cultural strategy, 180 pages, 54,000 words. 0 times the word Cockney's used. We then looked at the I Am London exhibition, and despite featuring 2 employees of Manze's Pie Mash Shop and a Pearly King, still 0 reference. Now you might think, guys, are you being a bit sort of paranoid and a bit touchy and sensitive? So we went a step further. We looked at the Mayor of London's website. Now this is incredible that it's got over its 12 years plus, 357,000 pages cached on Google, of which an estimated 375 million words, 186,000 times the word London is used, 178,000 the word Londoners, Cockney 22. And of those 22, all of, except one, really, sorry, two, are by third party. And the only time that the word Cockney evidently passed from the Mayor of London's office was in 2012 with the intentionally ironical, "I see no evidence of the demise of the Cockney accent." And I'll just quickly whiz through the reference point. So you might say, well, 22 references of Cockney. If you're Alaskan, you get 52 references on the website. Peruvian, 142. Samoan, 217. Dutch, 204. Sorry, Norwegian, 241. And the Dutch, 893. So just some, and so here's the list of references just to show the banality of the references. So there was an exhibition, and this is where the mayor's office gave a quote: "I see no existence of the demise of Cockney." There was an article about Jewish culture where a word Cockney crept in. There's a family explorator. Well, St Mary le Bow, the home of Blue Bells, yes, that did prompt a reference to Cockney, but again, nothing beyond that. Cockney in someone's name on an email, Cockney Sparrow, reference to a Cockney knees up at a Feast of Dawn. Someone else talked about the Cockney on an email. Someone speaking at event minuted saying, "You can tell I'm not a Cockney." Decline of Cockney culture, someone mentioned in their reference. A sounds event where there's the Cockney suite, reference to Cockney sparrow in a nature environment. And so you see there's just a very mundanity. And so really, as I say, where's this mundanity come from and what's caused it? And we believe that this tacit identification of Cockney as a racist, exclusively white, and we believe the concept of multicultural London English compounds the felony, compounds the challenge. One thing, if you define one thing as multiculturally, you're implicitly implying the other isn't. And what we're suggesting, it denies any continuity of Cockney lineage. So no matter how different people are, we had a lovely conversation with Tony White, from Novelist, and he shared how, like, he was sitting on a bus in the East End and heard voices around him, and he looked around and there was a mixture of races of people, but he couldn't tell by the. So I'm not suggesting that there's no difference or no significant and even seismic difference, but there still is this sort of thread of Cockney dating back to 660 years. And what we really feel is that the idea of multicultural London fuels a narrative of the far right and racist that, this, they come over here, swamp their culture, and really denied the host community any input to what they're called. And I think Steve may be elaborating a bit more about this branding issue, but certainly, I mean, my knowledge of sociolinguistics is limited. I can't say the word phonetics, but I do know something, having a career in marketing and PR branding. And really what we're suggesting here is that the concept of multicultural London institutionalized consolidates the potential obliteration, liquidation of the Cockney, as seen and witnessed from the Mayor of London's office. So we're saying that we're witnessing recent modern stereotypes. There's always been negative stereotypes about Cockneys. My grandchildren went to see some films recently, Matilda the musical and Puss in Boots, and they come back saying, why do baddies sound like Grandad? And, as I say, what we're witnessing, even the terrible Dick Van Dyke accent, at least he was a decent person. He was a person who had a Cockney accent, who wasn't a stereotypically bad, evil, naughty person, but a regular person. And so we've just witnessed this sort of consolidation of the negative, and you don't see this positive. My youngest daughter lives in Australia, and she sent me a clip from Australian children's TV, and there was a scene of a Pearly King, in a show. You just never see that on British children's television. So we're seeing this sort of denial of the existence of Cockney, and it's compound and growing. And so it leads to barriers, and it leads to, say, community activists like SAFE, increasingly marginalized and isolated as outside developers bring changes in the East End, and the host community has had its core culture and identity undermined, and an increasing gap between the powerful and those without, and the idea that a Cockney identity can provide a strength and a sense of community value. And I find a really frightening thing about the Mayor of London's evidence we've done from this is this idea, like the Hannah Arendt, about the origin of totalitarianism, but we're denying the factual existence of this thing called Cockney. So going forward, as I say, we feel that Cockney does have a positive role to play. There's a traditional positive. So I love the over 120 years ago from the autobiography of a supertramp. Cockneys make good beggars. They're held in high esteem by the fraternity in America. Their resource, originality, and invention, and a never faltering tongue enables them to often attain their ends where others fail, and they succeed where the natives starve. And certainly, I mean, we're going beyond that. We've got a rich heritage of a Cockney community that stands up for itself, stands its ground, stands together. You know, in our earlier month, we had an inspiring Cockney women talk and fabulous insights about the story of the Match Girls. Not only about a fabulous story, but a story that can inspire people of today. The Battle of Cable Street mural, where, as I say, challenging the myth that, say, EastEnders and Cockneys are racist. It was the East End community that stood up to the fascists. And so a sense of optimism. I don't think it's any coincidence that the anthem for West Ham United, "I Am Forever Blowing Bubbles," is a catchy tune, but also an anthem to eternal optimism in the face of constant adversity. So the sense of identity can be a very powerful asset, relevant for 2023, in empowering people to face up to and overcome adversity. So why has Cockney become taboo? Well, it may be a case of lazy thinking, unconscious bias, or conscious responses to negative stereotypes, and the stigmatization perhaps of one group of white working class. And by labeling Cockney as racist, it's not only it's unfair and unjust to those who are clearly not. And we come to turn up convenient confidence. So from our work last year, we found that confidence is a major driver for discrimination. That if you discriminate against somebody, that gives you a shortcut for gaining confidence. I am feeling superior to that person. And if you're discriminated against and you buy into that narrative, your confidence in yourself standing up. Or is there something else? So, as I say, we're proposing next year, we're going to go ahead with our Modern Cockney Festival 2024. And this is a technique that developed in partnership with University of Warwick and Dr. Chris Strelluf, as well as supported by the British Library, where we want to start off a massive conversation about what does it mean to be Cockney in 2023, and what does it mean, what's its significance and relevance, and how do we take it forward? So really say that key lessons I want to sort of provide people in the room is that working class communities don't have cultural institutions. I live in Wales, where there's 1,001 different organisations promoting the idea of Welsh and Welshness, yet there's not one for Cockney. And that really academics have a responsibility to society. And a point I spoke to Chris in the past about this idea of regenerative study, that not only sort of you study something, but you replenish the object that you're studying and make a positive impact for healthy societies. And it's a slippery slope if we pretend not to see, listen, or act. So, the lesson is we need to talk about Cockney. So, as I say, that's my sort of contribution, and suggest, Saif, that maybe once we've got the contribution from all the speakers, we get a conversation with the group.
Absolutely. That's a good
Good
starting point. Thank you, Andy. And we're going to go back to Chris. Are you back in the room? And
I'm back in the room. Can you hear me?
And we can hear you clearly.
Wow.
Really clearly now. So
okay.
I'll hand it over to you.
Good start. I don't know if it'll be worth all the trouble to make it happen.
Trues has got their hand up.
No, I can hear him now. Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Very well.
Thanks. I'll try to go through my portion quickly, since there was so much build up to it that I can't live up to. I'm going to talk at a fairly general level, assuming no knowledge of linguistics or sociolinguistics as a discipline, to talk to sort of what we mean by linguistic and sociolinguistic scientific approaches to language. Then provide some context for the labeling of multicultural London English, and some context for in the scope of this idea of branding, how the idea of tension between multicultural London English and Cockney and the status of these varieties is very much a question of how we think about languages, and how we think about languages as static objects associated with linguistic features versus faces versus people. And I think that will create space for thinking in more complex ways than just in terms of whether Cockney is dying, and indeed help provide an empirical basis for the sort of broadening work that Andy and Saith have spoken to. So I'll speak very generally about what linguists and sociolinguists do, and this is sort of the order of things that I hope to talk to. So to start, as a linguist, I engage in the scientific study of language, and I look at language as from a descriptive rather than a prescriptive perspective. So linguists try to look empirically at what's happening in language and not to make any evaluations of correctness or other sociologically based judgments that do result from the sorts of biases and problematic social evaluations that Andy was speaking to in his portion. Linguistics understands language as a component of human biology. So the brain builds language as part of childhood development, that languages that are alive and functioning change constantly, and that when we make judgments and evaluations of language, exactly as Andy was saying, that these judgments reflect social evaluations of people rather than any facts about language. And linguists carve language up into different domains to study. Broadly, these deal with the sound system, the meaning system, and the grammatical system, and as well as how people use these things. And I'll provide just a few examples. In the sound problems, there are some sound files that come from the Cockney Conversations Oral History Project that Cockney Cultures and some students from the University of Warwick worked to put together last year, and that will eventually be archived in the British Library. And I am happy to work with Andy and Saith to provide clips to give context for these, but just to show sort of the approach that we take as linguists to a data set. This is a sound wave from a person who identifies as Cockney. See, in the Haringey Council used to actually run the estates because they would just move. And take the sound wave, the waveform, which is this bit on top that's fairly an intuitive view of language. And from that, we can carve down to the components of speech and see how the vocal system is actually forming sounds, and use these sorts of acoustic features of the sound system to understand how different people are making different sounds. So this is the domain of phonetics. We study the sound system, and we do this empirically. And if we kind of look at a closer view of this, this is just the sound features for the word estate. And in the top picture, you have the vowel A highlighted, and we can use the different areas of energy to determine different parts of the vocal tract that the speaker is using to form this vowel. We can take measurements in hertz from these different features and then compare this person's pronunciation of this vowel to another person's at a different place or a different time in space. We can similarly see, if we look at a different view, the features of a sound like S, which makes a lot of loud noise in higher frequency ranges. The point of this is that we can use this kind of empirical data to quantify how people are actually speaking. And in the case of this speaker, I don't know whether my mouse is coming through, but we'd sort of put the first part of his vowel at sort of a mid-central place, which would be different from older versions of East London English, where the vowel nucleus would be at a lower frontal space. So this is kind of a starting point. We can look at the sounds people produce and scientifically understand how are they producing them and what the sounds they're producing are. We can look at the grammatical system, the morphology and the syntax of a language variety. And in this, another East London speaker says, and then they was going to knock them down. And the interesting syntactic feature here is the agreement that they select between the pronoun they and the verb was. Many Englishes use they were going to knock them down. Many other Englishes use they was as agreement here. And differences in the verb that is selected based on the pronoun in this case is a way that we can characterize differences among languages and varieties. This chart you're seeing now is an example of when we look empirically at those differences. So start looking at lots of speakers choosing, in this case, either they was or they were. And we can start to see that among groups of people, we can detect patterns of usage. So this is actually results of usage of this they was in Coventry, where I am right now. And what this tree diagram shows is that males tend to use the non-standard pattern they was more than females do. So we can go from empirically what people are doing to starting to see how social factors and the social categories people are members of may interact with their selection of different variants of language. And finally, as an example of change in the semantic and the discourse pragmatic domains, this is another self-identified East London speaker. And in this case, if you pay attention down to the text that they said, he says, like it, I like it, it's fun. Like I'll refer to them as a Scouse or a bloody miserable Mank. The interesting change here, of course, is in like, where in the first time he uses like as in I like it, the traditional verbal use, where in the second he uses it as a discourse marker, which is meant to introduce and sort of keep our focus on the topic that he's going to introduce next. So the interesting thing here is that there's this change and this innovation in a word that introduces a new meaning and a new conversational tool into the language. Now these data are mostly from Cockney speakers, but these points are not about Cockney specifically, but rather about what it is to be a linguist and what it is to engage with a language variety, and how we go from data in a language to making a conclusion like multicultural London English is an emerging variety, which may be then interpreted in some discourses as multicultural London English is replacing Cockney, or in the most sensationalist media accounts, Cockney is dying. So multicultural London English is become a widely used term, but often pointed to as the origin of that in the literature that uses labels for varieties of London English is an article by Jenny Cheshire and colleagues in 2011, and they provide this definition for MLE as a range of distinctive language features used in multi-ethnic areas of London. And they conceptualize MLE as a repertoire of features. In describing MLE, they are tying into a broader emergence that's been of interest, particularly in Western European linguistics and sociolinguistics, of varieties that are emerging in very large urban spaces with very dense pockets of speakers who wouldn't traditionally be associated with what's thought of as the language in that area. So Kite's-Deutsch, for instance, in Berlin is a label sometimes used for the German spoken by largely Turkish immigrants in Berlin, and the rapid change that emerges in the language. So an important note to make here is that the label multicultural London English does not come in a vacuum, but is part of a broader interest in the field in contact varieties taking place in urban spaces, characterized by large in-migration to an area that can result in very rapid language shift from one generation to the next. And it's important to have this broader context for these sorts of contact varieties. Some of the evidence that Cheshire and colleagues provide in that early work on MLE are that there have been changes in the vocalic system. So this goes back to the way that I suggested we do work with phonetics and the acoustics of speech to characterize the ways that people are actually producing their sounds. So on the left here, we have plots of the acoustic features of vowels by speakers in East London and several areas of London. And a really important change would be something like the changes in the vowel of face. Face in many Englishes is pronounced as a diphthong, meaning you start the vowel in sort of one pronunciation like a or a or eh. And then over the course of that vowel, you change the way that you're producing it to a different vowel. So when I say the vowel face, I start with a, and then I move to an E sound. And you see that depicted in these movements in the arrow. And in this older London speaker, we see face starting with a low central sound like ah, and then raising up over its production toward a target that would sound like E. So we get something like face, which is traditionally a Cockney pronunciation. In the younger speaker, we get a very different profile for this vowel. So now the vowel starts at a relatively high front position, something more like A, and then raises up to a target like E. So this sounds more like face rather than face. These kinds of changes in the vowel system are indicative of a dramatic change in the pronunciations of the sound system, and have taken place in the speech of younger speakers in London. This is one of the pronunciation characters, the phonetic characteristics of MLE. Cheshire and colleagues also look at a smaller set of morphosyntactic and discourse pragmatic features. So they talk to the emergence of quotative this is. So rather than saying, I said that this is really great presentation to have, I would instead say, this is me, this is really great presentation to have. They also talk to leveling of was and weren't, and this follows a polarity paradigm, meaning if people are using I was, we was, they was, in positive context, so they're not using the word not, basically. They'll tend to level toward was, where if they're using a negative sentence like I was not, or you weren't, they'll tend to use weren't. So this is leveling the system of was and weren't, but doing it along this polarity paradigm, which is unusual to a variety. And then finally, prevocalic determinative changes. So the words and the in many varieties of English, when these words occur before a vowel, they change to an and the. And one of the features they point to in MLE is that that these are also leveled. So rather than an uncle, you would have a uncle, and rather than the apple, you would, or the apple, you would have the apple. They also mention some changes in vocabulary, and this is very much something people think of as a change toward multicultural London English, but importantly, this isn't one of their sources, one of their characteristic features of MLE. So what I want to highlight in this is linguists do an empirical study of language, and in the work on London English, there are a discrete identifiable set of changes in the vowel system, the morphosyntactic system, the grammar, and in ways that language is used to navigate interactions and do things. So this is taking place in a broader context of contact among languages that were particularly interested in Europe, where large groups of people have come together and language is changing very rapidly. But while that's based on empirical data, there is still work that's relevant to our concept of branding that we're exploring in this. And what I want to suggest is the question of whether we think of Cockney dying or not depends on whether we conceptualize Cockney as a fixed variety or as a variety that is influencing other languages and that is subject to change, as we assume all varieties of language always are. So among these points, if we think about Cockney as a set of features that has spread to other places, and Amanda Cole gives many examples of this on a broader global scale, including the influence of Cockney on Australian and New Zealand Englishes, but a very salient example of the spread of Cockney actually throughout the UK is the increasing merger of the sounds associated with the letters F and the letters TH, which makes a word like the number 3 sound more like free, as in it was free to go to this webinar. This is app-based data, but the darker the colors in this map, the more likely people were, and the higher proportion of people were that had those sounds the same. So said the TH in a word like 3, more like the sound in F. This is traditionally a feature of Cockney, and all the evidence is that this traditionally Cockney pronunciation is spreading throughout the UK and some other varieties. Other changes that are pointed to as evidence that Cockney is being replaced by multicultural London English, if you will, are that H dropping, which is a traditional feature of Cockney, is being replaced by pronouncing the H. So in a word like house, producing the initial H instead of dropping it and producing something like house. The point that I'm happy to share in making sounds available is that the loss of H dropping is also spreading rapidly through British Englishes. So where I work here in Coventry, H dropping is a traditional feature, but over the last 100 years, it's become less and less common and has become socially marked, so that speakers born in the middle of the century seem to have become very conscious of H dropping and have started to retain it. So we have another change that's associated with MLE, but it's actually a broader change in British Englishes. I also point out that the changes in vowel systems don't necessarily mean that a variety is dying or needs to be relabeled to another. So this is an example from work that I do in the United States. And what's important here is that the empty triangles are words pronounced with a vowel like the vowel in frap, and the filled in triangles are pronounced words that are pronounced with a vowel in tan. And this is a mother on the left and a daughter on the right. And this mother and daughter produce these sounds differently. The daughter produces the trap at a backer quality, meaning it sounds more like trop, and produces the tan vowel higher in fronter, so that sounds more like tan than tan. But in this community, nobody talks about that language dying. It's just a feature of its change. And finally, the way that we think about changes taking place also matters for this question of whether something is dying. And so Cockney rhyming slang, of course, as we started the session, is thought of as this prototypical feature of Cockney. And certainly it's the case that teenagers on the street aren't using Cockney rhyming slang productively as a feature of their language. But if you take a list, and this is just a list off Wikipedia of multicultural London English vocabulary, and instead of thinking of rhyming slang as specifically using words that rhyme to mean something else, and instead think of it as a way to be creative, as a way to have fun with language, as a way to talk about taboo or criminal or common topics in ways that are interesting and fun and maybe obscure your meaning. We see the same kinds of things showing up in MLE vocabulary today, and indeed in youth vernaculars all over the world. So if you think about something as rhyming slang really being about linguistic creativity, then we see that feature very much alive and well. So from a sociolinguistic perspective, I think this issue of branding is very relevant because the question of whether Cockney is dying comes down to a question of how we brand Cockney. If we think of it as a fixed set of features, then yes, empirically we have evidence that Cockney, particularly in East London, the traditional area, is no longer being spoken. But if we think about Cockney more broadly as a set of features, as an ideology about language, as an ethos that's associated with cultural values, with things like hard work, humor, cleverness, creativity, then we can see evidence of features of Cockney in Englishes. We can see evidence of those values of language in varieties spoken today. And of course, as Amanda Cole points out in excellent work for public audiences, the Cockney diaspora is alive and well and continuing to evolve. So fundamentally, what I want to point to in this context of thinking about branding and language is if we think about Cockney, rather than being as a fixed set of features, a broader ethos of language and a set of features that's allowed to continue to evolve, then there is an empirical basis for thinking about Cockney as being much more alive and well than maybe sensationalist media, sensationalist narratives of Cockney dying would lead us to believe.
That's great. Thank you very much, Chris. I think that's added a lot of richness and wealth of knowledge to our own campaign, which is how do we recognize Cockney as a language? Is it a dialect? Is it a slang? Is it all of those things are being currently discussed at the moment as Tower Hamlets Council makes a statement within a month. So we'll be picking your brain on that one and hopefully putting a statement through from the sociolinguists to justify that. So thank you for that. And so next up, we've got Stephen, who's in the room. So we've got Stephen Cook, who's going to give us some insight as to more on the branding side and what sort of approaches we should take. I'll hand it over to you, Stephen.
Wow, thank you, Christopher. Thank you, Andy, and thank you for inviting me along. I'm so thrilled with the last thing that you said, Christopher, about branding as a fixed set of features. I actually feel that to use the word branding in the context of this conversation, the work that you're doing, is probably wrong. Because most people's view of branding is that it is a fixed set of features. And so we're probably going off on the wrong track already. Branding is many things, most of which aren't properly understood, and I'm not going to give you a lecture on branding here. I actually don't like the word branding at all. I am a strategist and I am a brand strategist, and that's fundamentally different in terms of systemic thinking to branding, which is a sort of fixed exercise in many ways. A state of mind and a state of being would be a better way perhaps to consider brand in its fullest context. Just for a little bit of background, I'm conscious we don't have too much time left. I am actually not a brand strategist anymore. I am the founder of 3 organisations that have been around for a number of years. One is The Unheard, and The Unheard is set to explore the voiceless, why they aren't able to speak, why when they are speaking they're not listened to, and why when they are listened to nothing is happening. But more importantly, what happens when the unheard who don't have a voice and don't exercise that voice and don't have agency are then adopted by others, often with good intents, who then misappropriate the voices of the voiceless, if you see it that way. The other organisation that I run is called The Unstitutional. We are worldwide and our focus is on citizen-empowered impacts in society, bringing together multiple groups, often across social divides, often looking at meta or systemic social issues around the world. And the third is a global community called The Untitled, which is for those of us who are not entitled, the ones that don't write the books and the papers and the reports and are left standing in the street wondering what the hell's going on in our worlds. So that's really where I come from. As a consequence of that, we spend our time with all sorts of groups around the world who are either unheard, or who are heard but not listened to, or who are represented by others. And so I would include Indigenous peoples groups around the world, Aboriginals. Every Aboriginal person is an alcoholic. Huh, that's not true. And yet that's a widely understood cultural stereotype if you happen to be in parts of Australia. It would be similar to saying that every Italian in Chicago must be a member of the mafia. That's a crazy thought too. So the idea that every Cockney is a racist, or Cockney somehow is a racist thing, we could kind of get stuck on that for a while. I need to declare to you that I am London Irish. And because I grew up in Shepherd's Bush and support Queen's Park Rangers, I've got no right to be in this room at all, apparently, depending on what you mean by Cockney. But I also spent a lot of time in the East End for various things, and I know we're talking about more than that, but I spent a lot of time at a wonderful, wonderful place called St. Joseph's, where I was responsible for leading the way that the UK government and healthcare systems consider palliative care. And St. Joseph's happens to be one of the most widely regarded, highly regarded hospices in the world. And I learned during that time that in Hackney, in East London, and this may or may not be true today, I don't know, but in Hackney, there were 373 separate first languages spoken. And the relationship with palliative care was interesting because that led to multiple different understandings of what death meant from a religious perspective, from all kinds of cultural perspectives, and that's just in Hackney. So the idea that we would consider something like Cockney as just language, just culture, just relating to changes in culture and multicultural perspectives from a community of people, for me is wrapped up in a much bigger conversation around what we feel we belong to, one way or another. And so when we work not only with cultural communities around the world, we work with people all over the world, for instance, around neurodivergence. What does that mean? So I can be Irish, living in London, neurodivergence, white, heterosexual, and an expedition canoeist, and a dad, and a granddad, as it turns out, all at the same time. Why would I feel that I'm being stereotyped in any one area? And so I think that Cockney is something. Oh, and I was talking to a very good Japanese friend of mine who's in New York, who is a filmmaker who's made wonderful films about the plight of young Asian girls in New York. And I happened to mention this, the Cockney Festival, and hopefully she'll be involved in some things. And she absolutely understood Cockney. She'd heard about it in Japan without any consideration that Cockney was related to racism at all. And I find it really interesting, something, Andy, that you mentioned earlier about the idea that the strangeness of somebody, the representation of Cockney by Dick Van Dyke appears to be the only one on your list that actually shows Cockney in a favourable light, because it's got nothing, the chirpy chap, the cheeky chap who's just a good guy, one way or another. And yet we've always thought of his accent as being terrible. On your point, Christopher, about language and vowels and things, my partner is American, and she uses the word herbs to describe herbs. And she made the assumption that that was American until I pointed out that Londoners, and particularly East End, the Cockney Londoners, will drop the H. So the question is, what to do about this? What are we going to do about a multicultural community representing a very historic cultural type, one way or another, where a lot of the history is wrapped up in the history of Britain and in the middle of a conversation about empire and colonization and the things, so that we broaden it out even further. What are we really looking at here? Are we looking at the historic core of London? Are we looking at working class London? And that, frankly, is my preferred area because it roots to the untitled, which is something we're passionate about. The people who have no institutional representation because it's convenience for institutions to forget about this. You know, somebody was talking to me the other day, we were talking about intellectual elitism. And the effortless insincerity of the intellectual elite around the world is really interesting. It's very convenient to marginalise and reduce and remove certain aspects of society when it isn't convenient to the broader societal narrative. So it's very convenient to think of sectors of society as being racist or ignorant or dumb or whatever we want to call it. And so these are things I think that we have to overcome. I'll stop talking in a minute because I have no easy answers to this, but I'm really looking forward to our time over the next how long it's going to be. One thing I will say, and somebody mentioned in the chat that Cockney multiculturalism is not new in London. I was talking to Andy the other day about the Irish in Northern Ireland, particularly in Belfast and Derry in the 1960s. When everything was going very, very wrong for the Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland, and how they chose, rather than aligning themselves with things like the IRA and violence and terrorism and things like that, how they were starting to align themselves with other civil rights movements around the world. So the Irish Catholics in Northern Ireland were aligning themselves with the civil rights movements in North America, with the anti-apartheid movement in South Africa and so on, because they wanted to be seen as a civil rights movement rather than a political movement or anything else. And I'm thinking that, and I don't know, and it's up for debate, but Cockney is a civil rights movement. There is an absolute right for the maintenance of a cultural perspective rooted in history that can be reappropriated for the modern age, just like everybody else is reappropriating everything for the modern age. And I feel that this is a central part of Cockney. Why wouldn't Cockney be aligned with Aboriginal peoples in Australia and Indigenous peoples in North America? It's the same thing, in my view. I think we need to broaden the conversation out beyond language and cultural tropes and get into something really deep and really meaningful about what it means to belong to a community in a part of the world, in a part of London or in London. And I guess I should stop there. I've been ranting a bit. I've got no easy answers because there are no easy answers. But anyway, I've been Steve, not a branding expert. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you very much, Steve. Well, that's been really fascinating, especially the sort of work that you've been doing in the background, which has been these three other organizations as well, which deal with the rights issue around whether people do have rights and autonomy to be talking about culture, language, and so forth, and are having those debates independently of what the institutions think. So I'm going to open it up. We're 2 minutes away from what we originally scheduled, but for those who want to continue, we'll continue with the question time for around another 10 to 15 minutes, I think. So if anyone has any questions, I'm sure there's a lot buzzing there. I mean, there's a lot buzzing there for me because I've taken loads of notes down. So if anyone has any questions, do write it into the chat or do unmute or put your hand up and I'll be able to answer that for you. Anyone? First question, Premier, here we go. So I'm gonna unmute Peru so he can answer that.
Yeah, thanks for the presentations. My question is to the linguist, because this came up in the Tower Hamlets discussion when the petition was presented. Multilingual English was used as a juxtaposed to basically an attack on the petitioners, asking for Cockney to be recognised as the vernacular of the East End, and that's what it is. I want to shift the debate from say, is it a language or a dialect, to it's a vernacular for Londoners. That's what I think, and I think that's what happens when people come together. They have more in common than differences, because everyone's under the cosh, if you know what I mean, in London. And you gotta find a common vernacular to communicate, and it's a dynamic vernacular as well, like all languages, and it shifts and it changes. It gets pulled in one direction, gets pulled in another, and I find it disingenuous when people try to freeze it and set up divisions, because it's not done with other languages. That's what I come from SOAS. I studied linguistics. I didn't study English. I studied Arabic, Middle Eastern languages, and they shift. And same in terms of Arabic. You've got different dialects, different synonyms, etc. No one's attacking anyone or setting up barriers. Everyone still sees it as a common vernacular, but with different flavors and different pulls. And it's the same for my background in Bangladesh, where you got a common language, but people have different dialects, different regions, and different vernaculars coming from different communities. But no one's accusing anyone of not being part of the vernacular or juxtaposing one group against the other. So I find it fascinating why it's done in London and what's the politics behind it.
That's a very good point. So I'll just put it out there. I mean, why do you think this is happening in London in particular? Is there a thing that's particularly targeted towards Cockneys or particular languages or vernaculars? Put it out there to Chris first, actually.
Well, I mean, I think what you're doing really nicely is calling attention to the fluid nature of things. So there's, you know, a classic saying in linguistics that the difference between a language and a dialect is the difference between an army and a navy, in the sense that if you have power and sort of national force behind you, then you can have a language and not a dialect. And you're calling attention to how socially constructed these differences are. I need to do a thorougher review of coverage of the label Multicultural London English, because I don't think in any way Cheshire and colleagues meant to say that. I don't think they ever took the position that Cockney was dying, as it came out in press releases that followed that. You know, you point out the subjectivity, the political motivations of using labels like dialect and variety, and how socially constructed these are.
Over to you, Steve. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, what's the agenda here? London's a big place. It is multicultural. It's trying to attract people from all over the world. There are tons of issues around its economics and things like that. So there's a broader agenda, perhaps, I don't know, but coming out of the mayoral office. My work, I wrote a foundation piece that became the UK civil society strategy. So it's very interesting looking at, you know, what's going on all over the country and then comparing that to other countries around the world. So that was interesting. I feel Cockney is really complicated because it's in a multicultural framing one way or another. And so that framing, and I mentioned the reframing earlier, I think we shouldn't be trying to kind of, it's almost a question of not defending the Cockney stereotyping in any way, shape or form, but rather trying to understand the complexity of the one thing and then using that to Cockney's advantage. It means these things, so we shouldn't limit it to things like language or class or type. It's a state of mind. And I think for me, that's much more the direction that these conversations and hopefully the thinking in the future should be. It really has to be that. It's complicated. And if we try and look at one area and one area only, we're likely to carry on a sort of segmentation and marginalisation that we shouldn't really be aiming for, I don't think.
That's a good point. Andy, did you want to say something?
Yeah, can I just pick up really on the point Steve made there? And the metaphor I use is that I think now there's a recognition that this thing called Cockney and the cultures and societies and people has got more complicated. So I've been reading a history book about Poplar and Poplarism in 1921. And in 1921, 75% of the working population in Poplar lived and worked in Poplar. and they weren't
Yeah.
exposed to mass media, international media, and so on. And contrast that now, where you've got people with very much more complex, complicated lives, and their sense of who they are and how they operate invariably gets more complicated. And I think what we witness in that environment is this idea of Cockney has been pinned on a stereotype that at best is a fossilized caricature, but at worst, I say, this identity of a white working class racist. And therefore, as I say, we witnessed with the Mayor of London's office that that's been going on for about a dozen years or more, of this sort of marginalisation, denial of a sense of Cockney. So, and I just fear that the advent of multicultural London English and using that term has give a further rocket fuel for further marginalisation and suppression of the fact that Cockney, well, it did exist, it existed a generation or so ago, and is not relevant now. And so I just will challenge that. That really, I think the analogy we got is that yes, sociolinguists come on the scene and studied the changing language of and had a vernacular and words and so on used, but then in their response came up with a branding strategy of, oh, it needs a new label. Whereas I challenge that, and I say, I think I've used an analogy that it's what they've come up with the idea that this more complex situation, let's give it a new word. It's like putting a new on it, rather than actually really expressing that actually this blank is actually more of a quilt, and it's a much more complicated quilt, much more, many more patchworks and dimensions to it. And so as a consequence, I believe not only got an inaccurate label, but then an inaccurate label that carries negative consequences for how identities survive and exist. So as I say, I think there's a challenge we've got here. Yeah.
That's a very good point. I mean, I just add to that before I go to your questions. I know there's some questions in the audience. Is that also multicultural? Don't forget when David Cameron came in, it was dropped for a while, and it was kind of like a word that people didn't particularly want, even in parts of East London, want to go around banning either. So these words are constantly in flux, I think, and how we define ourselves as a collective is something definitely up for question. I'm going to go to B. Is it Bob, or I don't know whether there's an acronym for something, or I think there's a trying to communicate through Zoom through. So I'm going to go to Bob because he had his hand up, Bob.
Hello, yeah, no, it's O'Brien, my second name, so it comes up as.
Sorry,
well, as the conversation moves on, there's so many more points coming up that I don't know really where to start. I mean, first of all, I'd like to say I'm really pleased that this has been brought about, because I suppose for years I've been trying to break down Cockney stereotypes, and for myself, and I realise how hard it is for working class people to get on in society, but having a Cockney accent and being, as Steve said, treated as either thick or untrustworthy, not by other Cockneys, I must say, but from people from, I was going to say the outside, but I suppose it was a class thing really. But I've managed to break down those stereotypes over the years for myself, but I still see it in other people. I think it's got a lot better nowadays. I think, as you use the term multiculturalism, but as people have become more accepting of one another and more tolerant, I think, accents have become less of an issue. You see it on TV now and the media, where we have all different accents introduced in programs, etc., which is a big sea change, really. That acceptability of an accent. You would never have got people like us introducing on the BBC years ago. There'd be complaints, and we, Cockneys were a caricature, and we were only exposed in crime series and things like that, and yeah, it just wasn't like that. And that quote that Andy brought up earlier with the guy who said, "I don't identify as this, I don't identify as that." I mean, he was obviously looking at it purely from one end of the spectrum. I think it's a big mix. It's a big part of London. So many different people. Where when I grew up, yeah, and when I grew up, it was mainly white working class people. But amongst that group of people, you had all different sorts. Different ideas, different languages. You talk about the Cockney language. I consider my Cockney accent soft compared to some people I know. And then some Cockneys I know, they might have gone and got a job in the city and they speak with a plum in their mouth. You know, it's such a wide ranging thing. And I do think it's a culture. And I do think that some of the things that Steve was saying, it's how you feel. We've also got to look at Cockney as something that's evolved over the years. Time moves on, history moves on, and accents change, people come in, people go out. You know, that's just the way of life. And this racist thing, I've really got to challenge that. You know, that lazy view of the white working class person being, like I said, either thick, a gangster, or racist. It is just an easy way to stop people talking. You know, it's just an easy way to say, oh, you can't join in this debate. You're just white, middle-aged as well. Don't help.
So that's interesting.
And I'm sorry, but the media don't help either. And some white working class people don't help themselves either. And
that's a very good point.
You know,
I'm just thinking about.
I'll also go to one more quick point. I know that there's a thing about the white working class racist exiled in Essex and the diaspora, which Andy mentioned at the start. There is still a resentment there, I think, of being. I'm not going to say it was all pushed out. I mean, a lot of people took the King's shilling, but you know, there was a lot of social engineering went on with the GLC and Thatcher as well, right to buy. All these different elements came in, and I think there is still a resentment there, but I wouldn't call it racism. But that's another point. I mean, I've never done a study into it. That's a feeling I get. I get a feeling that people still resent the breakup of a community. You know, and I don't think it's about skin color because most of them Irish, Jewish, Italian descendants anyway. You know, it's not like they're uneducated about heritage or anything like that. It's just, you know, anyway, so much to discuss in this. I've probably gone on far too long.
Very good point.
Thanks for the time.
I think the question there, which I tried to decipher, was one of them was, how does a caricature come about? That's the question for, probably I'll start this time with Steve. How does a caricature come about? Who made us into this caricature? And do caricatures change as well? Or are we soon to see a different form of Cockney coming about? You know, Poshney, Mockney, I don't know. How did these come about?
It's a really interesting question, and it is too complicated to answer in this short time that we have here. But when we think about the convenient truths that those who have voices are able to tell, then they hold all the cards. You know, at the end of the day, this creep over time, and the problem for one of the many problems for Cockney is the length of time that Cockney has been around. It actually counts against it in many ways. But I think that creep, there is no doubt. I put my hand up a few minutes ago to say that I am in fact not multicultural. I live in a multicultural society, but I'm not multicultural. And somebody was saying in a thing I was in yesterday that we do not have the right to accept other people's realities. We have our realities, and it's not for us to put our realities onto other people. And this applies across all parts of society, one way or another. So I think the creep, the political, again, as Peru puts in the chat there, politics plays a huge part, the suppression of working class people. And I'm not here to go on a kind of socialist communist diatribe, but you know, this suppression of working class people, who after all have traditionally been the majority in many societies, Western societies around the world. So I think there are a lot of reasons why this happens. The question for me now is how to sort of reappropriate cultural means that we can belong to. This is really important, because we're living in a world, and again, we see it, I'm sure you all see it every day, where people are basically falling apart because they've got no idea what they're supposed to be aligned to. The media, as somebody again mentioned in the chat, plays an enormous part in all of this. The lazy stereotyping of all sorts of people is something we see every day. I mean, on a personal note, we see it just in our family with my partner's 7-year-old autistic son, and how the systems in this country fail him. It's got nothing to do with which part of the world he's come from or anything. It's to do with his mental health and how that works. So we see this everywhere, you know, and I think it's time to, at the risk of sounding really shit, I think it's time to take the power back. You know, I think we have to start understanding that our systems are broken. We all recognise that they're broken in actually very complicated ways, and they're broken all over the world. And that we have, it's why we stand for system empowered impact in society, because we have a right as individuals to claim ourselves back, wherever that is, in my view. Not answered your question, I've just gone on. Sorry.
Very good one. I found out it's Bruce O'Brien. It's not Bob, by the way. And I'm going the same question. Thank you, Steve. Power. Can we take our power back, Chris? I'm going to hand it over to you.
I mean, I also don't have I mean, I think for me the important thing to repeat is the socially constructed nature of this. And so, you know, to talk about empowering is also, I think, first to recognize that the disempowerment that happens when a group is stigmatized, and part of their stigmatization is the way that their language is characterized. It's important to recognize that. So I'll repeat kind of the linguistic tenet that languages, by being inherently part of human biology, a language variety can't be good or bad. And so anytime we make an evaluative statement about people's language, we are using that to encode our evaluations of them. The differences that we recognize between language varieties themselves are socially constructed. As an American, I'm not sensitive to many of the highly salient differences in British Englishes. To an American, British people sound smart because that's our ideology about British varieties. But those meanings change locally. So I don't have the answer, but I think the answer starts in recognizing that a language variety can't be good or bad, or pretty or ugly or lazy or industrious. Any evaluation of language is actually an encoded evaluation of the people. Once the stereotype of the people or the evaluation of the people emerges, then language becomes a way to encode those prejudices and evaluations against them. And I think empowering, I hope, starts with recognizing the constructedness of our evaluations of language, and that those aren't linguistic concepts. Those are 100% sociological and social concepts.
Thank you. And Andy, finally, I know we've gone over by 18 minutes, but for those who can continue, obviously there's a lot of interest in this subject, and I think we've unpacked a lot. But Andy, the whole thing about caricature comes up.
Yeah, well, I think it's arisen because partly because there's a vacuum, and I think I don't come up with an answer, but certainly the first steps in creating a better place to explore it is what we're doing here with the festival. It's an emergent space where we're putting it on the agenda. We're highlighting that actually part of the conversation is what's not being said, such as the Mayor of London's office, where it's credible, like sort of cultural denialists. You could even say it's almost like a cultural cleansing of Cockney design. And so I think bringing on Chris's point about a principle and a belief and a value about being open and respectful of different cultures, and also I think we've got to then be mechanical in terms of providing a space for the conversations that stem from that. So just a brief point there, and but as I say, I think it's brilliant what Brian was saying earlier about conversations and Dan in the room and other people. So again, this is all part of that process.
Thank you very much, everyone. We've come to 20 minutes past, and I'm aware that everyone's probably dying to eat something. It's lunchtime, and the pie and mash shops are open, I've been told. So thanks very much. Thank you very much for your questions, Bruce, Puru, and everyone. And we'll make the recording available soon, hopefully, and then so you'll be able to see it later if you need to reference. And thank you very much for Steve, Chris, and Andy as well. And we've got Andy's going to say a few things about art.
Well, just going to say we've got some forthcoming events. So we've got some live events this Wednesday in London at the Royal Society of Arts near Charing Cross and Embankment Tube. Invisible Discrimination, where we've got the leading expert on anti-Semitism and also ageism, as well as this issue about Cockneys being discriminated. And we've got another live event next Tuesday about social class in Britain in Whitechapel at 5:30 p.m. And then also on Thursday, we've got Current East End Struggles, featuring Cy from Notes of a Peruse in the room, and one or two others. And then also we're finishing on April the 3rd. Sorry, we're not finishing on a penultimate event on April the 3rd is Are You Having a Laugh, featuring the legendary Arthur Smith and Dr. Mary Owen, a specialist, and a musicologist, Tom Carradine. So we're going to finish on traditional Cockney manner on a high and a good spirits, and then we're looking at a final event about our plans for next year. So a massive thanks for everyone taking part there. Do check out our website www.growsocialcapital.org.uk/Cockney, or our Facebook group, the Modern Cockney Festival.
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and I'm going to stop the recording if I can find the button. Here we go.
And that was